Hi, I'm Christine Tully, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend and Publish, and welcome to episode 90, Fixed Schedule Productivity. I'm going to share a couple of slides that describe a technique called fixed schedule productivity. Many people refer to this. I think it's in Getting Things Done and some of those other productivity gurus such as David Allen and people like that. And I first heard this phrase actually not from any of those sources, but from a blog by Robert Talbert. And he talks about how he actually applies fixed schedule productivity to his academic work. And for me, this has been a really useful way of thinking about when I'm doing certain tasks for academic work and when I'm doing things like family tasks or taking my car to be repaired or something like that. So I'm going to share with you a couple of tips about how I apply this in my my regular academic life. And there's a little bit of a caveat with this, and he does acknowledge this in his own blog post, but certainly this type of thinking about your schedule, fixed schedule productivity, which I'll define in a minute, this type of thinking about your schedule does rely on a couple of factors, one of which is that you do have some uninterrupted time of at least a half hour or more. In current academic work, for many of our contingent faculty, depending on your institution, you might be teaching a lot of overload. But I know even at my institution, I do have the luxury of being a full professor. Even I am teaching extra classes, there's extra meetings, there are less faculty to do a lot more of the work. So it is harder and harder to come by an hour or 2 hours free without some requirements. And he actually makes the argument that thinking about a fixed schedule, meaning you have some rules about when you're using time and for what, really helps use the time available in the most efficient way. And so I want to throw this out there with a couple of definitions from him, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like for me in practice. So for those of you that are just listening to this on audio only, I'll describe what it is you're looking at. It's just a quick chart. So if we look at Talbert's definition, this one really struck me. And normally I don't put a lot of source material and a lot of quotes in our podcast episodes, but I really liked this for the current moment of still working during a pandemic, still working when things are uncertain, and just kind of thinking about boundaries around what types of tasks for university work happen and when. And so this is what he says. He says, the way we usually work as faculty is to start with the work we have and work forwards from there, grabbing whatever time is available to get the work done and stretching that time until it fits the work. Fixed schedule productivity is the opposite. We start with a fixed amount of time and work backwards to optimize our work to fit the time. So I will put a link to his blog in the show notes where he talks about this idea a little bit more, but essentially what he does, and he even describes his own system in his post, what he does is he basically says, these are some rules about my working. So one of the rules that he talks about is that he doesn't spend more than 50 hours a week on his academic work for his university job. So he's not going to work more than that if something isn't finished. 50 is the boundary. And so I've applied the same sorts of techniques to my own work with some rules and a few caveats. So his two ways to set up fixed schedule productivity are twofold, right? We just heard them in that quote, but basically you have to set a goal of not working past a certain time, or you might set a fixed number of hours per week. You might set a certain time of day that you work on only certain tasks. So for me, I've long mentioned that I usually write weekday mornings, 5 days a week, and that's when I get my academic or my scholarly writing done. And then the second thing that he says is really working backwards. Once you've made your rules, find some productivity strategies to help you maximize that. And here's where I think our podcast can be really of use to you, because as if you've stuck with us through 90 episodes, or maybe you're just discovering us, one of the things we try to do is throw a bunch of different strategies that might work for you at different times in your scholarly writing life. Some strategies are really important at certain times. Others might work in 5 years. So, this is one way that I think some of the advice we're putting out here on the podcast might be useful, because generally we have lots of little techniques for the times that you have. So if you're looking for some strategies to meet your time, that would be one way to go about looking at it. If you're not familiar with us on YouTube, so if you're only listening to us as an audio podcast, we do have a YouTube channel that shows all of our slides. And then vice versa, if you only watch us on the YouTube video channel, we do have audio podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so you can get the audio content. So I encourage you to check out our back episodes. We have tons of episodes about cutting time for teaching, maximizing your writing time, getting started when you're stuck, and so on. So there's lots of information that I think would be helpful there. Also, speaking of being stuck, if you're interested, we will have a workshop on overcoming writing slowdowns upcoming in September, on September 21st, 2022. So by the time you hear this episode, it'll be starting within a day or two of hearing this episode. But if you're interested in joining us, I'll put a link in the show notes. That would be another way to kind of think about how to stop productivity slowdowns. So let me show you what this looks like in practice, because I think this makes a lot more sense when you actually hear what somebody is doing to apply fixed schedule productivity. So here are my fixed schedule activities that I'm just using as examples. For writing, I'm still doing scholarly writing on weekday mornings. And for me this semester, so sometimes this is semester dependent, but for this particular semester, I'm doing it 8:30 to 10:45 a.m. I was doing it 9 to 11 a.m., but this semester, that's what I have available. And I actually had an extra 15 minutes in there. So I'm squeezing out a little extra productivity this semester. So what I'm doing during that time, and this is what Talbert talks about, having the tasks to fit the time, is I'm working on a book revision. So at the moment, I am only working on a book revision. I've talked about this on multiple podcasts. I'm getting it finished this September. So there are two steps that I know that when I'm working during that time frame that I will always do. One is I will always look at my Asana project management board. I actually described this in the last episode 89, about how I got back into writing after not writing for a while. So I will always look at that first to refresh my memory on the big pieces of the project that are unfinished. And then I'll also log into my Penzu writing journal. I've talked about Penzu a couple different times. And I actually show this in episode 89, how I actually just keep notes about the writing and what I'm doing next. So this is how I know on, let's say, a random Tuesday or a Wednesday, when I go to my writing at 8:30 a.m., I know what it is I'm supposed to be doing. So I really like this idea of saying, okay, this is my writing time, but also saying, what is the thing I'm going to work on in the writing time? And I know some of you who have been with us for other workshops, we've talked about if you're managing multiple projects, you might have different rules or different fixed schedule rules about the types of things you work on certain days. I know a lot of faculty work on conference presentations on Fridays versus working on what I would deem sort of harder, theoretical kind of work or something like that. It's not that making a conference presentation is not difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult, but sometimes just the different type of work is a good way to use Friday energy. But in any event, if you're thinking about writing, this would be the first thing that I would look at, is figure out how many hours a week am I shooting to write, and when can I do those in the best chance that I'll actually be able to pull it off. So for some folks, this might mean little scattered half hours all throughout your week, because that's all you've got. And that's something that you sometimes have to just work with what you have. I know in an upcoming workshop, we'll talk a lot about that fragmented time, how to really work with a time compressed schedule. We'll offer a workshop on that coming up in the future. But in general, the other thing I know is, for me, I must write 10 hours a week. So that's why every weekday morning I'm writing now 2 hours and 15 minutes every morning, that if I don't do it then, I'm going to find another time to put it in. So, this is why I need to make sure that I have it scheduled and at the best time, the best chance for it to happen. If by chance, say, something interrupts it, for example, a sick child at school or something like that, I'll look somewhere else in that day to see what else I can move around to give myself that time back. It might mean that I don't do, for example, other university work. Maybe I had an expense report I had to do that has to get pushed off again or something like that. But I would recommend starting with writing and just deciding, what are your rules about writing? How many hours are you going to write a week? And then what are you doing during that time? For the other categories on here that I show on my chart, for those of you just listening in audio, teaching is another spot where I have a definite rule about what I do with teaching prep, what I do with grading. And for this semester, how it has played out is that I generally in the fall use Sunday nights in America. I'm watching Sunday night football. Generally, I'm also prepping for class at the same time. I might be doing some grading during that time, but that usually is about 2 to 3 hours on a Sunday night to get set up for the week. But I also do class prep, about an hour of class prep after classes that I've taught during the week. So right now I have a class at 11 o'clock every day. After that class is over, I will take some time, maybe 30 minutes, to just prep for the next class to make sure that I'm ready. And that has worked the best for me because that way I don't forget. And a lot of times I don't leave my classroom because this semester there's not a class after me. So I can sit in there and set up the next class before I actually get out of that teaching space. Also, just some other quick rules. I always start with grading anything that needs to be graded. I've made a commitment to return work in a more timely fashion this semester. So I always do that. I always post new content. I always review the syllabus just to make sure where I am in the semester. It's easy to get lost with multiple classes. And then I figure out what activities I'm going to do for the week using a strategy I call pattern teaching. So pattern teaching, I describe in episode 35, if you want to check that out. It's a great episode about saving time for teaching preparation. And then the other things, family, I just have pretty much made a commitment. I've held to it for many, many years that usually I don't do any work from Friday after 5 until Sundays around 7. So that really means I don't do work on the weekends. Now, can I work on the weekends, and have I worked on the weekends? Yes. So with fixed schedule productivity, the one thing I don't like about it is sometimes it's not always fixed, because sometimes you really do have a deadline or something else that you have to get completed, but I don't make a habit of it. So while I will work on a Saturday, I sometimes will go into the office on a Saturday if it will work out that I can do that. It's not a regular occurrence, and that's what I'm trying to get away from. The other thing that I try to do is other university work. So all those things like I design workshops for tenure and promotion. I do many reports. There's some assessment things that have to be done. There's some required trainings, committee work, all of that. In general, I try to put that in other small slices of time in my workday. And I also try to make sure that I'm not doing any of that work till after 12:30. So I reserve the mornings for writing up until the point where I go and teach. I do a little prep after, and then after that, whatever time I have left at work before I need to pick some children up from school, that's the time that I'm getting these other things done. I also do work, because people ask me this all the time about owning my own academic business. All the work for the company is generally completed between 3 and 5 p.m. on weekdays. And I do that, some of that work on the weekends, before anybody might wake up on a Saturday or something like that. So, it's not perfect. You'll notice there's some things that aren't in this schedule this semester that I like. Normally, I like to be working on 2 to 3 projects at once to move a lot of things forward. But I have just made the commitment that until I have fully completed this book revision, I'm not doing anything else. So that's what the schedule is for writing. I'm not guessing every time I go to a writing session what I'm going to work on. I know every single time. So I encourage you to think about these strategies and check them out. I will put a link to Talberts' post in our show notes for this episode, as well as a link to the episode on cutting prep with pattern teaching if that's something that interests you. Happy writing this week.